At 7:12 on a gray Tuesday morning, the first flatbed rolled past the neighborhood entrance like it had every right in the world to be there. And that was the moment everything broke. By the time the second truck pulled in behind it, I could see her across the street, standing in her driveway in a robe and slippers, coffee halfway to her lips, frozen like she'd just watched someone unlock a door she thought belonged to her. 3 weeks earlier, she had laughed in my face. That morning, she wasn't laughing anymore. Her name was Diane Holloway, president of the Ridgewood Estates HOA, the kind of woman who said community standards like it was scripture and carried herself like she'd been elected mayor of a kingdom nobody else knew they were living in. And the building those trucks were heading toward, that old white church with peeling paint and a leaning steeple, had been sitting empty for nearly a decade, long enough for everyone in that neighborhood to stop seeing it as anything but part of the scenery, like an old fence or a dead tree. To them, it was harmless, quiet, and most importantly, it didn't do anything. But I don't look at land like that. Never have. See, my name's Ryan Cole, and I run a small logistics support outfit just outside town. Nothing fancy. A couple service trucks, some short-term trailer parking, a handful of owner-operators who need somewhere legal to park between jobs without getting hassled or fined or worse, towed in the middle of the night because someone didn't like the look of their rig. It's not glamorous work, but it's honest, and it keeps things moving, literally. Lumber, roofing, feed, you name it. Most of it passes through hands like ours before it ends up where people want it. And people like Diane, they don't see that part. They just see noise, diesel, and inconvenience. Now that church, the one those trucks were pulling into, sat right beside the Ridgewood entrance, close enough that every single resident had to pass it on their way in or out, but just far enough outside the HOA boundary that their rules stopped at the edge of its gravel lot. That detail, right there, was everything. 8 years it had been sitting empty, weeds crawling up the fence, asphalt cracked open like dry earth, the place slowly folding into itself while the neighborhood next door kept its lawns trimmed and its mailboxes polished like nothing was wrong. They treated that church like a buffer, like free protection, something that existed for their benefit without them ever having to think about who actually owned it. But I noticed something different the first time I drove past it. Not the broken windows or the sagging gutters, but the way it sat on that narrow stretch of land, right along a secondary road that fed directly into the highway. Clean line of sight, easy access, just enough separation from the HOA line to make enforcement tricky. Most people saw a ruin. I saw leverage. I didn't rush it. I watched. 6 months, give or take, just keeping an eye on patterns, who came and went, which was nobody, no maintenance crews, no for sale sign, no contractor bids posted anywhere. That told me more than any listing ever could. A property like that, sitting idle but still technically owned, that usually means one thing. Whoever's holding it isn't really holding it anymore. They're just stuck with it. So I started asking questions, quietly, not through gossip, not through neighbors, straight through county records, digging into the title history until I found the thread. The church was still tied to a small religious trust that had basically dissolved years ago, congregation gone, funds dried up, just a skeleton organization keeping the paperwork alive. There was an attorney listed, local guy, handling whatever loose ends were left. Taxes were barely current, insurance minimal. The building wasn't loved anymore. It was just carried. That's the kind of property most people avoid. Too messy, too uncertain, too much history attached. But to me, that's where the door opens. I reached out once. No back and forth, no drawn-out negotiation, just a clean offer, proof of funds, short inspection window, because I already knew I wasn't buying the building, I was buying the position. The lot, the access, the fact that it sat right where Ridgewood couldn't touch it, but had to look at it every single day. 3 weeks later, papers were signed, and I didn't say a word to anyone. Of course, word still got out. It always does in places like that. Small town, tight circles, and my name wasn't exactly unknown. A couple years back, I'd had a run-in with one of their board members over some access improvements near my yard. Nothing illegal, but they didn't like the idea of more trucks coming through their side of town. Another time, I got a letter about overflow parking that wasn't even on my property. So when people heard I'd bought the church next to their entrance, they didn't see a guy fixing up an old building. They saw a problem moving in. The first letter showed up 2 days after closing. Heavy paper, formal tone, signed by Diane herself. She welcomed me to the area, talked about the neighborhood's commitment to beauty, peace, and continuity, and strongly encouraged me to preserve the church in a way that aligned with community expectations. Community expectations. I remember reading that line twice and just kind of smiling to myself, because it told me exactly what I needed to know. I hadn't joined their HOA, I hadn't signed anything, hadn't agreed to a single one of their rules, and yet here she was, writing like I'd just stepped into her jurisdiction. 2 days after that, she came by in person, brought another board member with her, both of them smiling like they were there to welcome a new neighbor, but there was something tight underneath it, like they were testing the ground. We stood out by the old fence line, wind pushing through the weeds, and she asked what my plans were. I told her I was still evaluating options. That was true, just not in the way she hoped. She nodded, took a sip from her coffee, and said, "Well, I'm sure you understand the residents would be very concerned if the property were to attract commercial activity. Traffic, noise, that sort of thing. It could really affect property values." I let that sit for a second. Then I asked her, calm as I could, "Are you speaking for the county or just for yourself?" She didn't answer right away. Just looked at me, smile fading a little, like she hadn't expected that question. And that was the moment it clicked for both of us, I think, that this wasn't going to go the way she was used to. She didn't answer my question, not really, just gave me that tight little smile again, and said something about working together for the good of the community, which, in my experience, usually means they want you to agree before they tell you what the agreement is. Then she turned, walked back toward her car, and I could feel it right there in the air, that shift from polite curiosity to quiet opposition, like a switch had flipped somewhere behind the scenes. From that point on, it wasn't about what I was going to do with the property, it was about what they were going to try to stop. And they started fast. First came the calls to county planning. I know because a guy I'd dealt with before, Mark Jensen, called me up 2 days later and said, "Hey Ryan, you've got some folks pretty worked up about that church lot." He sounded half amused, half tired, like he'd seen this movie before. They were raising every concern they could think of: noise, drainage, traffic flow, environmental impact, you name it. Like a gravel lot was suddenly the most dangerous thing in the county. Then they shifted angles, started framing it as a safety issue, saying trucks near a residential entrance would be a hazard, headlights at night, diesel engines early in the morning, painting this picture like I was about to turn their front gate into a shipping yard. When that didn't slow anything down, they went public. Emergency HOA meeting, flyers on mailboxes, group emails, all the usual channels. I didn't attend, but I heard about it from a couple of residents who actually took the time to come talk to me instead of just assuming. One of them, older guy named Frank, lived 2 streets in, said the meeting got heated quick. Diane stood up in front of everyone and said the property was about to become a serious threat to neighborhood stability, and that they were already working with the county to block any commercial use. People nodded, some got upset, others just looked confused, because up until that moment, nobody had even thought about that church in years. Funny how fast something becomes a problem once it's no longer under your control. Then came the petition. Signatures, comments, the usual mix of genuine concern and borrowed outrage. I saw a copy later, phrases like protect our community, preserve property values, and my personal favorite, maintain the character of Ridgewood Estates. That last one always gets me, because what it really means is keep things the way we like them, whether we own them or not. Meanwhile, I kept doing what I'd been doing from the start, staying quiet, watching, and most importantly, checking the actual facts. Because here's the thing, none of what they were saying mattered unless it lined up with what the county had on file. And that's where most people go wrong in situations like this. They argue opinions against opinions, volume against volume, instead of just going straight to the one place that actually decides anything. So I pulled the full land file. Zoning classification, historical notes, prior use permits, everything tied to that parcel. And it didn't take long, maybe 10 minutes, to find the part that made all the difference. That property wasn't locked into some permanent religious designation like Diane had been telling people. Years back, when the road expansion happened, the county had reclassified that strip as a transitional use corridor, basically meaning it sat between residential sensitivity and light commercial flexibility. Not wide open, but not restricted either, as long as you met certain requirements: surface prep, drainage, entry width, Sight distance, nothing crazy, just standard compliance stuff. In plain English, it meant the land could work. That right there was the crack in their whole argument. And then, like they always do when they start losing ground, they got a little more creative. Code complaints started showing up. My cleanup work got reported, gravel delivery got reported. Even the survey stakes were flagged like I was doing something suspicious by measuring my own property. One board member drove by slow enough one afternoon that I could see him taking pictures from his window, probably building a little file to send off somewhere, hoping something would stick. Then came the rumor that almost made me laugh. Diane started telling people that the land had permanent religious use restrictions, that because it had been a church, it couldn't legally be converted into anything else, especially not something commercial. She said it with confidence, too, like she'd already verified it, repeated it at the meeting, in emails, probably in casual conversations on the sidewalk. And you could see it working. People relaxed a little, thinking, okay, maybe this isn't actually going to happen. Problem was, it wasn't true. And I knew it wasn't true because I had the paperwork sitting right there in front of me. I thought about correcting it publicly, maybe sending out something, pushing back, but then I realized something. The more they talked, the more they committed to a position that was going to collapse on its own. Sometimes the best move isn't to argue. It's to let someone be wrong long enough that everyone else notices. So I didn't say a word. Instead, I called Mark back at planning and went through everything step by step. If I bring in gravel, level the surface, mark designated parking, control access, I'm within compliance. He walked me through it, confirmed each requirement, even double-checked the classification to be sure nothing had changed. By the end of that call, I had two things locked in. 1, the plan was completely legal if I built it right. 2, the HOA had spent the last week trying to stop something they didn't actually understand. That's when I stopped watching and started moving. First came the cleanup. Nothing dramatic, just clearing out years of neglect, broken debris, overgrowth, getting the space back to something usable. Then I had a load of gravel brought in, spread it across the old cracked parking area, leveled the worst sections, widened the usable part near the side lane where trucks would swing in. It wasn't pretty, not in the way Diane would have liked. No landscaping, no decorative touches, just function, clean lines, defined space. A couple of the neighbors drove by while the work was happening, slowing down, watching. You could feel the tension building, like everyone was waiting for someone to step in and stop it. Some official, some authority, but nobody came. Because there was no reason to. I put up a simple sign near the road. Private commercial parking. Authorized vehicles only. No announcement. No explanation. Just fact. By that point, word had fully spread. I heard Diane had called another meeting, more urgent this time, telling residents the situation was escalating, that they were exploring all available options, which usually means they're running out of good ones. Frank stopped by again one evening, leaned on the fence, looked out over the lot, and said, "You know they really thought this place was untouchable, right?" I nodded. "Yeah, I figured." He shook his head, half smiling. "They're not used to being told no." That stuck with me, because that's really what all of this was about. Not noise, not traffic, not even property values. It was about a group of people who had gotten comfortable thinking that proximity meant control, that just because something sat next to their world, it belonged to them in some unofficial way. And now that illusion was starting to crack. The last piece went in late Monday afternoon. Final grading, clear entry path, enough space marked out that anyone pulling in would know exactly where to go. I stood there for a minute after the crew left, looking out over it, not glamorous, not impressive, just ready. And I remember thinking, this is either going to work exactly the way I planned, or it's going to get a whole lot louder before it settles. Turns out, it did both. By sunrise the next morning, I got my answer. First truck rolled in just after 7, a flatbed hauling framing lumber. Driver I knew. Miguel, good guy, steady work. He backed it in like he'd done it 100 times, even though it was his first time on that lot. No hesitation, no confusion, just a clean swing. Lined it up along the far edge and killed the engine. Then came a box truck about 10 minutes later, then 2 pickups from a roofing crew that had been waiting weeks for somewhere legal to stage closer to the highway. Within an hour, the place looked exactly the way I'd seen it in my head months earlier. Not chaotic, not loud, just organized, purposeful working. And that's when Diane showed up. Same robe, same slippers, But this time she didn't even pretend to sip her coffee. She stood across the road, just staring at the sign like maybe if she read it long enough it would rewrite itself. A couple minutes later, another board member pulled up behind her. Then two residents stopped on the sidewalk, arms crossed, watching the trucks like each one was a personal insult. I didn't walk over, didn't say a word, because there was nothing to say. Everything they had been arguing about for weeks, every warning, every claim that it couldn't happen, that it wouldn't be allowed, was now sitting right in front of them, running smoothly before most people had even finished breakfast. No chaos, no blocked roads, no hazards, just a piece of land doing something useful. And you could see it in their faces, that shift, not from concern to relief, but from certainty to doubt. Because it's one thing to fight an idea, it's another to stand there and watch it work. That Thursday night, the real fallout hit. They called a special HOA meeting, and this time, it wasn't about speculation, it was about explanation. I didn't go, but word travels fast, especially when things don't go the way people expected. Frank called me halfway through, stepped outside just to give me a rundown, said the room was louder than he'd ever heard it. Apparently Diane stood up and tried to walk everyone through what had happened, talked about how they had raised concerns, contacted the county, explored their options, all the usual language, but this time it didn't land the same. Because now people had questions. Real ones. One resident, younger guy, new to the neighborhood, asked straight up, if this was legal, why were we told it wasn't possible? Another followed right after. Did anyone actually check before telling us it couldn't happen? And that's where it started to unravel. Because up until then, the board had been operating on confidence. They spoke like they knew, like they had authority, like proximity gave them influence over anything within eyesight. But now that confidence had been tested, publicly, visibly, and it didn't hold. Frank said voices got raised, not screaming, but sharp, frustrated, the kind of tone people use when they realize they've been led by assumption instead of fact. Someone mentioned the petition, asked what it had actually accomplished. Someone else brought up the meetings, the emails, the urgency of it all, and why none of it had changed the outcome. And Diane, from what I heard, she didn't have a clean answer. Because there wasn't one. You can't explain away a mistake that big when it's sitting right outside your front gate, filling up with trucks and running just fine. That was the part that really shifted things, not that I won. Because I never saw it like that, but that they had spoken with certainty, built momentum, stirred up concern, and still ended up powerless when it came down to what actually mattered: the land, the records, the law. The complaints slowed after that. Not immediately. There were still a few calls, a couple more reports, but they didn't carry the same weight anymore. It's hard to keep pushing when the thing you're pushing against is clearly standing on solid ground. Within 2 weeks, it went quiet. And the lot just kept working. Trucks came in, trucks went out. Drivers had a place they didn't have to worry about. Contractors had somewhere to stage without risking tickets or complaints, and everything ran the way it was supposed to. No late-night chaos, no disasters, no collapse in property values like everyone had been warned about. Just steady, practical use. Life moved on. Except, not completely. Because every single person who drove through that entrance after that morning saw the same thing. That old church, the one they'd ignored for years, the one they thought existed for their benefit without them ever having to think about it, was now something else entirely. Not an eyesore, not a ruin, but a reminder. That control isn't ownership. You can hold meetings, write letters, organize petitions, speak with confidence, even believe you're right. But if your name isn't on the deed, if the rules you're quoting don't actually apply, then all of that is just noise. And I don't say that like it's a victory lap, because honestly, it wasn't about beating them. It was about understanding something they didn't take the time to understand. The difference between what feels true and what actually is. I still see Diane sometimes. Not often, but enough. She doesn't wave anymore, doesn't stop to talk, just drives past, eyes forward. And I don't think she hates me, not really. I think what bothers her is what the whole thing represented, that there was a line she couldn't cross, even though she'd gotten used to thinking she could. And look, I get it. People want control over their environment. They want things predictable, clean, consistent. There's nothing wrong with that. But there's a difference between protecting what's yours and trying to control what isn't. That line matters more than most people realize. So now I'm curious what you think. Was I out of line for turning that property into a working lot right next to their neighborhood, knowing they wouldn't like it? Or were they out of line for trying to control something they didn't own in the first place? Because depending on how you look at it, both sides thought they were right. Drop your thoughts in the comments. I read more of them than you think, and I'm genuinely interested where you land on this.